Anyways, on to talking about Shawn Michaels and why he's part of the favorites list. Thank you for watching part 4 of the video. What made Shawn Michaels so special was not just his well roundedness, but also the fact that he's been so enduring. Remember his classic match against The Undertaker at WrestleMania, and how he's really not only just a clean like baby face, he's a backstabbing, overly flamboyant and overly arrogant heel who betrayed his tag team partner of many years. He was part of the Attitude Era and what really launched that. He made a great comeback in the 2000s, and he did make it seem like it was one of those sympathy or cheap pop comebacks that was just, well, at WrestleMania, I'm going to take you a peg down, son. And it's just like, and then you'll leave after that. And it's just like, he actually came back for like a good 7 or 8 years, it felt like. And I think that Shawn really had the best career comeback ever, probably. Maybe Terry Funk's was better. But I don't think Terry Funk ever really left. He kept doing those crazy Japanese death matches, something out of Fire Pro Wrestling in real life. I think that Terry Funk probably was one of the secret programmers of Fire Pro. If you've never played that, it's a Japanese wrestling game with some crazy matches in it. But back to HBK, I think that he was really one of the guys who was given birth to as a character in the ring without having to attempt to blur the lines. And he also was able to be hated or just absolutely beloved, able to make us forget some of the past transgressions or weird things that he might have done, such as like posing nude or something like that. The Montreal Screwjob thing has become the stuff of legend. Everyone loves Shawn so much that even when he becomes a heel in character or in real life, I'm not saying he's done anything wrong, I'm just saying that I think that people love him either way. He's a true legend. He's probably um, in contention for best wrestler of all time if you don't just pick him right off the bat. I mean, you would have to really search the world, and someone else who you find probably wouldn't be as well rounded. They would probably be able to cut it in the ring, but not as much on the mic. And some guys are great talkers and mediocre wrestlers, and some guys reverse that. But Shawn Michaels was both, and Shawn Michaels he made wrestling feel fun again in a time when there was a lot of guys leaving the company. WCW is getting bigger. Um, you know, there's the steroid scandal. There's other things about unionization because um, the baseball protest of like 1994. Didn't they stop the entire season or something? Anyways, I think that Shawn Michaels made it fun again. He came out there in these like weird kind of Chippendale style outfits. He was wearing like assless chaps and a cowboy hat and stuff, but somehow he was just so committed to the character of just being kind of like Ric Flair in the sense that he was so flamboyant and he was so confident and he was so committed to the character. That's something I'll probably say again in this discussion is committed to the character. You know, he really made you believe what he was saying, not just because he was great on the microphone, but because of conviction. I think that he really appeared on TV as his character. He didn't just have to do some sort of blur the lines with reality, break kayfabe, and in a sense kind of hurt wrestling, almost like that. There's an inflation of kayfabe in the same way there's been an inflation of violence in the sense that guys have to go farther and farther. They have to, like directly, mention, oh, my contract's up. I wasn't having a good, time. I was arguing with the writers, and it's like, is this professional wrestling? Are we supposed to suspend disbelief and actually have fun? Is this supposed to make us feel young again in the sense that we're buying into a crazy, unrealistic character like John Cena fighting a 48-year-old man and The Rock? And I know I'm out of date in some of these match references, but, fuck it, I don't have cable. Anyways, these are my favorite wrestlers, so that's what matters on this list at least. This is opinionated. Maybe some people you think are worthy of a greatest of all time spot that I may not be experienced with or may find boring. Anyways, let's get on. HBK and Bret Hart too, who are, other than the Montreal Screwjob, not names I bring up too much together. um, I think that paired together, they really helped re-legitimize wrestling, and maybe are the reasons. Hulk Hogan is the name most synonymous, along with things like Andre and Randy Savage. But when you talk about wrestling in the 90s not dying and actually going on in a couple of years to its most fruitful point, probably in the Attitude Era, if you really look at those guys and the great battles they had with each other and with others, I think that they really kept wrestling from dying in one of its darkest periods, where not only were people leaving, um, numerous companies had folded in the last 10 years. There wasn't much of a sense of international appreciation. There wasn't the ability to see things from new companies like there is now on YouTube or on other companies by linking things. The internet was in its infancy, and there's like things like message boards and AOL were still at that level, having minutes on your cell phones and pagers and PDFs and shit. But in that kind of environment, I think that they helped wrestling not just ossify into a sad shell of its former self that kind of dragged on for a few years and died, like most people's attempted career comebacks who aren't named Shawn Michaels or Terry Funk. Anyways, moving on from there, let's get to probably the most accomplished wrestler of all time who wasn't booking himself, Triple H, Ric Flair, the very prototype of fantastic wrestler. I mean, not only could he cut some of the most entertaining and coke-fueled promos of the 1980s, I mean, he was great in NWA and in the WCW as part of the Four Horsemen. He was great as a heel, and the fact that he's able to convey emotion so much. I mean, look at when Charlotte turned on him, and she basically said, "I want nothing to do with you because you weren't there for my whole childhood." It's like you didn't know who to boo almost. Like Flair was crying, and he had so much emotion. I mean, it's amazing he never went on to be a actual like Hollywood actor with those kind of chops of really making you buy it, making you buy the expression, and just wow. But since what she was saying was actually a good point, it was hard to take a side, and so just seeing that almost look into somebody's family, it might have been scripted, but to see that kind of window into someone's family, it shows you Ric Flair's ability to add to his matches in terms of emotion, even into his older years. And that style, I think Ric Flair really is the reason for WWE, in the sense that he added entertainment to wrestling. He wasn't just there to, have a 10-year title reign and a bunch of chest hair and sell tickets. Ric Flair was one of the first flamboyant, cocky, almost heinously cocky, um, and at points cowardly wrestlers. Guys who used a low blow or a roll up to end a match. Not always, because there's of course the figure four leg lock, but Ric Flair, I think without him, we might not have guys like Shane Douglas, Jeff Jarrett, Chris Jericho, CM Punk, and so many others. Shawn Michaels, Triple H. It goes on and on. I mean, really every heel since the 70s, since wrestling really injected character into itself and wasn't trying to actually fake being like Greco-Roman mat wrestling, since the birth of professional wrestling, it really was born in the womb of the character of Ric Flair, and he's probably the greatest on stage presence and character, and one of the most um, believable and well convicted to his character guys in the history of wrestling. And I think every heel, and a hell of a lot of faces, think of the fact that that's the Ric Flair robe. The figure four is still associated with him. You still have people yelling "woo" whenever there's a chop, which is one of the most common elementary strikes in all of wrestling. It's kind of like how they yell "what" at people during promos when there's nothing to do with Stone Cold. Ric Flair is everywhere in wrestling. He's like God almost, and he's omnipresent because his influence is omnipresent. And it sounds like I'm about to stick him at number one, but keep in mind this is a top 20 and he's 13 on an unranked list. But yeah, he'd definitely be at the top. Um, Best fucking heel ever. Part of some of the best stables and tag teams ever. Part of some of the most gory matches in terms of like blade job kind of things, and some of the most memorable matches wherever he went. Even when he was old, he developed a style that works well. I think in the sense that moves like the low blow and moves like the roll up and the figure four are things that Flair was able to do, and he was able to have memorable matches like the aforementioned one against Michaels. And they were able to play up his age, like kind of like ECW played up Terry Funk being a 54-year-old man. Like he's 100 years old and he's some convalescent getting up out of a wheelchair to wrestle a match, and it's like Jesus, and it's like it's not that old, but it's like Ric Flair really was legitimately fucking old, kind of like Terry Funk is now, and I guess has been for a long time. But Ric Flair was able to come up with a moveset that involved enough of the the displayment of his character, and use of simple moves so that he could keep wrestling and putting on really good matches, even with just simple moves, um, like into his 60s. And it allowed them to still use him as a character and in matches at WrestleMania and stuff, like major shit, legitimate stuff, not just a cheap pop like on a Raw reunion show or something. Like he's there for years, and it's like I feel like that way they were able to play up the age thing, like he's get it heel heat for someone, he's beating him up, he's a 60-year-old man, or get face heat for Flair. Not that he really needs it because he's such a legend, but in the sense of like he's 68 years old and he still did all of this. Isn't that impressive? And so his age, but the fact that he was still able to work, really allowed that both of those things to kind of congeal together and to create kind of a great career renaissance in the late 2000s. Not that Flair ever really stopped per se. Um, he's one of those guys who, like I said, is omnipresent in wrestling. If you mentioned Hulk Hogan, you mentioned the 80s. It's two things that are synonymous. I think wrestling going on to become professional wrestling, and you could argue about the value of sports entertainment. I'm not a fan. I prefer hardcore wrestling like ECW. But what wrestling is today couldn't have really become itself, and what wrestling has been for a long time now in terms of character and cutting promos. And it's kind of like how in the late 50s those rockabilly bands were formulating the basic formula of having like a drum kit, electric bass player, a singer, and a guitarist. And that was like, how many bands went on to follow that? The Beatles, the Zombies, the Animals, and so on. And it's just like that became the basic rock formula, even on to like more heavy things like Megadeth or Metallica, or getting on to like black metal or whatever. They took that basic formula and they botted it. They made it heavier. Um, Anyways, so regardless of if you like sports entertainment, the evolution of wrestling, um, Ric Flair, it was really, like I said, born in the womb of his character, and his contributions in blood, sweat, and tears throughout practically his entire life to every step on the staircase of life to wrestling. He's given everything you possibly could, and in terms of entertainment too, he's given everything you possibly could entertainment-wise, from matches against Terry Funk to that really emotional match against Michaels, that retirement match where he was like, "Kick me, you bastard," and it was like, and Shawn had that hard time, that debate morally if he should actually put him out. Yeah. I mostly remember Flair for his work when he was older. I was born in the mid '90s, so keep in mind that I was born after the Four Horsemen and the first golden age. I became a fan in 2006. I've been a fan for 14 years since then, and that's why my favorite wrestlers are a little bit slanted towards old people, not old people, but people from the 90s and 2000s and stuff. Anyways, regardless of that, I think that again, wrestling was born in Ric Flair's womb. Everything it is today, in every sense, pretty much owes to him. I never considered myself that huge of a Ric Flair fan until I stopped. I really looked back at his contributions and the quality of his matches from the point of view of that WWE style of, they're slower paced, but it allows them to add more emotion. And yeah, he's bladed his head to where it's kind of horrifying to look at. It looks like he just cheese grated himself repeatedly, and he probably has at some point. Um, but yeah, Flair, I think his slower style has allowed guys like John Cena and even guys farther back, to wrestle and guys like the that were mediocre workers but could really contribute to the build up. It's allowed them to work a match at their pace, their natural pace. I think Flair also kind of contributed that to wrestling in his older years. Um, Anyways, yeah, number 14. You may have heard of this guy. He worked the Indies for a few years before moving on. Real underrated, mostly in Japan. Some guy named Stone Cold Steve Austin. Anyways, moving on to my real favorite wrestler, which is actually Michael McGillicuddy in a tie with John Laurinaitis. I'm obviously fucking kidding, but anyways, yeah, Stone Cold. I mean, there's a reason during Punk's most notorious promo when he was about to leave the company before a year later he actually did, and then he came back making it all completely meaningless in hindsight. Sad. Uh, yeah, we're looking at Steve Austin, the what Hulk Hogan was to the classic family friendly period of the 80s. It's kind of like looking what were the Beatles to music in the 60s. Um, you know, I think that Austin is the Attitude Era. Him being allowed to just say ass and get constantly and give people the middle finger and it's not that he was doing anything particularly violent or new in the ring that we hadn't seen before, but he had an awesome finisher out of nowhere. I think gave rise to later things in WWE like the RKO or the Code Breaker. The idea that it's an out of nowhere finisher that can be hit, um, to turn on the fans. I don't think they could ever really pull off a heel Stone Cold without the fans still cheering him. They'd have to do a lot, and he'd probably still be faking them, faking a heel turn. Anyways, regardless of that, I think that Austin really is the embodiment of the Attitude Era. You could say The Rock was, but I think Austin. I mean, The Rock was. He might have said candy asses and kick your candy ass or something, but The Rock was also almost a fusion of the cartoony style of the 80s and his ability, his natural charisma. I mean, that's why they call him the most electrifying man in sports entertainment. Um, the Rock's natural charisma allowed him to work that kind of almost corny style into a sense where it was so exciting, even though you knew what he was going to say. You're in the palm of his hand, and so I think that Austin really is the better embodiment of the Attitude Era because he was really the one. He was really the edge on that knife, whereas if you look at someone like The Rock or Triple H, they were more like the handle, the back of the. They were not really the edge. They might have occasionally said a swear word, but Austin is getting completely censored out by the TV station. He's having his microphones shut off long before they started to make that a cliche. And again, he had probably the best finisher of all time. It didn't look corny or fake. It's not something that would obviously work outside of wrestling, like a sleeper hold or something that would work in like an MMA match. It was a wrestling move, but it was a great one. It was out of nowhere, and it got an amazing pop. Whoever he used it on, most of the time being Vince McMahon. Um, we have a few more people. I think there might be one more part to this video. Let's get to that so I don't again get cut off. Love you guys because you're you. Uh, BRB, bruh.